Tanrı'nın varlığına ilişkin siyasi argüman nedir?
Yeah, so the political argument for God's existence. Jeremy Neal and I developed this in our paper in your European Journal of Philosophy of Religion, and I developed it a bit more in my recent God and Political Theory. It basically goes something like this. Here's kind of like an easy way to kind of move from beginning to end of the argument, right? So it seems like that most people in the world have a seeming, right? Have some sort of experience that inclines them to believe that governments have authority over their citizens. That there's a difference, right, between me taking out a gun and saying, "You'll listen to me, give me your money," and the government saying, "Hey, listen, you need to give us money, right? Taxes, right?" The government actually has genuine authority to do that, while I would lack such genuine authority. And so there's this kind of question: if we're going to take this seeming in a sort of a real way, and in a way that sort of honors the seeming, the question is, like, how do we make sense of it? How do we make sense that governments have robust political authorities? And it's not just with, say, the government has the right to prevent us from killing each other or from stealing, or that the government has the right to tax us, but it's also the government has the right to, like, create infrastructure, to fund schools and educations and even the arts, and to make official languages, or to try to emphasize certain commonalities between its peoples. And so the ability to even explore space, and to use funding to journey into the deepest parts of the universe, right? Seems like the government has the ability and the authority to do these things. And so the question is, how, right? How does the government have that authority? And so there are different theories that have been put forward trying to explain how governments have robust political authority. You have certain views, we can call them contractarian views. You have the traditional contractarian view, which says that, well, the reason why the government can tell me what to do is because I've forfeited some of my rights, either implicitly or explicitly, in order to gain some of the benefits of the state. So maybe I forfeited my rights to all my money, or I forfeited my rights to be able to go out and do whatever I want to do all the time, in order that the government protects me, right? So I've kind of exchanged some of what's naturally mine. I've exchanged it for certain protections or guarantees by the state. And so on this view, I ought to obey the state because I've signed my rights away, or at least part of my rights away, right? There's another view, we can call it a hypothetical social contract theory. We'll talk about that in a second. And there's also another account called a consequentialist account. What I'll do here is I'll kind of break down these accounts and tell you why I think they fail, and give you an alternative account, a theistic account, so to speak, and tell you what that has going for it. So what's wrong with the social contract theory? Well, a lot of my critique is inspired by Michael Huemer. And Michael Huemer points out that a valid contract, for a contract to be valid, it has to meet certain conditions, right? For example, there needs to be a reasonable way to opt out of the contract. Right? So if I said, "Hey, you have to, in order to be in, say, some particular room, maybe you need to be in this room for, I don't know, your PhD defense or something like that." And I said, "All right, well, in order to be in this room, I'll let you in this room, but you have to actually sell all your property." Okay. Even if you really needed the PhD and you were like, "Fine," like, there's no real reasonable way to opt out of that, right? It's not like you really were free in reference to making some sort of agreement between each other, right? You actually didn't, you weren't really free, at least what we mean by free. You sort of were forced into it, so to speak. And so a contract shouldn't be like that. A contract, you should be able to freely enter in, not be coerced in either soft or hard ways. And so, you need a reasonable way to opt out. Well, here's the thing. Can you opt out of your citizenship? Well, perhaps not. Or perhaps even if you can, you would have to give up family and friends and your education, and you'd have to give up, all what you know and is familiar to you. So this is a really hard thing to do. And what are you going to opt out for? What, you're going to go live in Antarctica? Or are you going to go to another state that makes you sign a contract with them? So it seems like there's really no reasonable way to opt out of, say, your citizenship. Moreover, there are other issues as well. Like, in order for a contract to be valid, we have to have some sort of understanding where implicit consent is trumped by explicit dissent. So say you go to a restaurant, usually there's an implicit agreement going on there. You go to the restaurant, you say, hey, I'd like a burger and fries and a Coke. And what happens? The waiter or waitress comes and brings out a burger, fries, and a Coke. There's this implicit agreement that you're going to what? You're going to pay for the food. But what if you sat down and you said, hey, listen, I want a burger, fries, and Coke, but I'm not going to pay for anything. If you bring it out, I'm going to eat it, but I'm not paying for it. Well, then what happens when the waiter or waitress comes and brings you your food? Are you actually obligated to pay for the food? Well, some people have the intuition that actually, no, you wouldn't be obligated to pay for the food if you explicitly said, I'm not paying for it. So in some ways, while some people might try to say, well, even though you haven't explicitly consented to a contract with the government, right, exchanging some of your rights for some of the government's goods, nonetheless, you've made an implicit agreement by utilizing the state's resources, using the infrastructure, calling 911, right, calling the police, that sort of thing. But what happens if someone says, actually, I'm going to use your resources, government, but I'm explicitly dissenting from the government and its authority over me, right? Well, it seems like if it really was just that it's all based on a contract, if that's why you have to obey the state is because you make a contract, well, then it seems like social contract theory is not going to give us good reasons to tell us why people who dissent from the state actually still have to obey the state, even if they wouldn't like to. So it seems like a good theory about political authority. It's going to need to capture that. It's going to need to capture why explicit dissenters still are obligated to obey the state. And like I said earlier, if it's really based on a contract, then it seems like it's going to be an invalid contract if there's no real reasonable way to opt out of the contract. So for these reasons, I follow humorists that I don't think that social contractarian views are actually good accounts of why you ought to obey the state. So you might think there's like another view called hypothetical social contract theory, which says something like, okay, you didn't make a contract with the state, or at least most people don't make a contract with the state. But the idea is that if you were offered to make a contract with the state, you would take it. And so it's kind of analogous to like if the doctor finds you unconscious and starts to revive you, they can work on you, they can operate on you, given this kind of counterfactual that if you were conscious, you would ask the doctor to work on you. At least if you're reasonable, you would. And so, well, maybe this is how we should understand political authority. Well, that doesn't seem to work either, because there are people who, again, are conscious. I mean, it's not like we're all unconscious here, who explicitly dissent and say, doctor, don't operate on me, right? Or in this case, state, I don't want your exchange. And so, again, how are we going to make sense of explicit dissenters? And in the literature, people talk about, well, they're just not being reasonable, but what is reasonable here? And it opens the door for a whole bunch of other questions. And so, the thing is, even though this hypothetical social contract view is trying to endorse that, kind of make this sort of parallel argument where we ought to obey the state because we would have made a social contract, a social exchange, if presented to us. But the main sort of depiction of that is through this hospital example. But obviously, the hospital example is not analogous because we are conscious, we are aware of what's going on. So, finally, there's a consequentialist account. Picture yourself on a boat that's sinking, and you're telling everyone they need to get the water out of the boat. And they're like, no, it's fine. It's totally cool. Nothing's going to happen. Well, some people think that you're justified in taking out a gun and forcing everyone to actually take the water out of the boat because you're in an extraordinary circumstance. If you don't do that, everyone's going to die. So some people think that, well, it's permissible to do so given the consequences, right? And so maybe the government's authority over us is like that. Maybe if the government didn't tell us what to do, everything all chaos would break loose. People would be murdered and raped and beat up and have no property, and things would be crazy. So you know what? Maybe the government has the ability to tell us what to do because, hey, if it didn't, all hell would break loose. The problem with this is that one of the problems is that this really only gives us an explanation for why the government has authority over us when it comes to kind of just like taking care of protecting life and maybe property and maybe enforcing contracts, kind of the libertarian sample of things. But it doesn't tell us why the state is also able to coerce us when it comes to creating culture, when it comes to creating infrastructure, when it comes to the arts and the sciences and the funding of space exploration, right? Because obviously these aren't like dire things that if we don't have, all hell will break loose. And so there's also another issue of like, is this scenario actually showing that you, the person with the gun, have genuine authority over the people that are on the boat that need to bail the water? Or is it saying that while you don't have that authority, you still have the right to coerce them? So it isn't even clear to me that this account is actually an account of genuine authority, how you come to have genuine authority, rather than just maybe it's permissible that you can coerce someone against their will, right? So anyway, we don't need to get into all those details, but the main thing is that in the field of political philosophy right now, there's not really a consensus view on a good account of political authority. And in fact, there are commentators who just say, who kind of say, well, yeah, maybe mine works, or maybe this works for some of the government's authority over me, but there's really not a lot there, a lot of disagreement. And so what Jeremy and I we offer up a theistic account where we say, well, no, God creates humanity, and He tells them, He wants their flourishing. This is after Wolterstorff. He gives them authority, performance authority, and says, all right, you have the ability to have authority over people if you seek their flourishing, if you seek their shalom. And so God kind of sees this performance authority and says, all right, I'm giving this to you. Kind of for those who are familiar with Chinese philosophy, the right of heaven, so to speak. And you can lose it. For example, you don't pursue the flourishing of your citizens, but the general idea is that you have this right to where you can create your citizens' culture, you can create infrastructure and space exploration and the fine arts, you can protect life, property, and enforce contract. And it's grounded in God, and maybe indirectly in the way that God has created us, given us the sort of natures that we are, as Aristotle would say, as social and political animals. So anyway, that's kind of the argument, is like, wait a minute, if all these secular accounts fail to make sense of how the government has genuine, robust political authority over its citizens, but this theistic account actually does succeed in making sense of that, then maybe that should give us some reason to think that, even if it's a small reason, nonetheless, it adds to the probability of the thesis that God exists. And so in my latest version of the argument, I kind of say, well, let E, the evidence to be explained, be that governments have robust political authority. You'd expect that at least a little bit more on the hypothesis of theism rather than not theism.